Good afternoon and welcome to today's three-part program devoted to the Emperor's Private Paradise, Treasures from the Forbidden City. I'm Mike Hearn, the curator of the exhibition here in New York. And after my talk, we will be joined by Nancy Berliner, who curated the exhibition at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, where the show concluded on January 9th. Nancy has been working with the World Monuments Fund for years to oversee the restoration of the private paradise. And so it's a great privilege to have her here to share her expertise and inside knowledge about the garden. Nancy's lecture will be followed by a talk by Ben Wong. Ben has been attached to the China Institute for many years, where he's much beloved by a worldwide audience, particularly well known for his translations of Chinese poetry, and he'll be talking about that as well. Before I begin, I'd like to first acknowledge some of the organizations that have made the exhibition possible. The Peabody Essex Museum organized the exhibition in conjunction with the Palace Museum, and all of the objects in the exhibition are derived from that single source, the Palace Museum, most of them from the garden itself. And of course, among the many supporters that enabled this to take place is the Mandarin Oriental Hotels Group, American Express. Additional support has been offered by the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and ECHO, Education Through Cultural and Historical Organizations. And in particular, the Freeman Foundation has been a very generous supporter of all of the educational programs in conjunction with the exhibition here in Salem and in the third venue, which will be Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So many thanks for all of our sponsors. The topic of this garden is, for me, one that is not only about a space, but it's about a state of mind. The Qianlong Emperor, the fourth ruler of the Qing dynasty, the Manchu dynasty, which was the last imperial dynasty in China, which began in 1644, ended in 1911. And the Emperor Qianlong's reign actually spanned some of the most important historical events in Western cultures. George III was just being notified by some obstreperous colonists in America in 1776 that they were declaring their independence. Catherine the Great was on the throne in Russia. Louis XV was ruling in France. And of course, the American Revolution and the French Revolution all took place during the 60-year reign of the Qianlong Emperor from 1736 to 1795. And it was the emperor's intention, here we see him in the 56th year of his reign at the age of 81, that when were he to reach 60 years on the throne, that he would retire. He stepped down because he did not want to surpass his grandfather, the Kangxi Emperor, who ruled for 61 years. So with that in mind, the Qianlong Emperor began to plan as early as 1771 for a retirement garden and palace within the Forbidden City. I suspect that he probably first justified this expense as doing something for his mother, who was in her 80s. She lived until she was 85. And when the garden was completed in 1776, she was celebrating her 85th birthday. So probably that was the initial impetus for the garden, but then Qianlong looked ahead to his own retirement. What is wonderful about the garden and its contents is that this is the only place remaining in China that preserves the taste and the opulence of the Qing dynasty at its height of power and wealth. The Summer Palace was, of course, destroyed in 1860 during the Opium Wars. All of the other palaces have been remodeled and renovated over time. But this 2-acre plot remained a time capsule of 18th century taste at its most extravagant. And that's what makes it so unusual and also telling. Because when we look at the emperor, we see the formal portrait, the way he wanted himself presented to history, you might say. It's frontal, symmetrically disposed, practically very rigid formal posture in his court robes. But the garden leads us into the secret world of the emperor as an individual. And that individual is someone I'd like to explore a little bit more today. First, a look at the Forbidden City itself. For those of you who've been there, you know that it's something like 3/4 of a mile from the Wu Men, the Meridian Gate, to the back gate if you walk along the central axis. And it is the axial disposition of the architecture that is so striking about this complex. It is all aligned on a north-south axis with every building symmetrically disposed. And the reason for that is the symbolism of architecture has everything to do with the concept of rulership in China itself. The purple Forbidden City, as it's known in China, Zijincheng, refers to the purple luminous constellation with Polaris at its heart. So Polaris, the North Star, was the guiding light of the universe, and by extension, the Chinese ruler was meant to be the North Star of his empire. So everything reflects that sense of symmetry and order, the harmony that was essential to govern an empire the size of China. There's only one space in the entire complex where this symmetry is relinquished, where asymmetrical Taoist principles of geomancy and the informal spaces of a garden could actually take precedence. This larger complex is the Ningxiu Gong, the Palace of Tranquil Longevity. And it was built by Qianlong probably first for his mother, but ultimately it was going to be his retirement residence should he reign for 60 years. But when he reached that point in 1795, although he gave up his title of emperor, he gave himself an even more grandiose title, Taishang Huangdi, Super Emperor. So while he did cede the throne in name to his son, he remained in his principal residence, which was right here. He never moved into this retirement palace, so he never actually surrendered the reins of power. But it was this space that is the focal point of today's exhibition, and it is really an amazing opportunity for us to get inside the mindset of the emperor. This 2-acre garden is actually filled with halls. There's some 27 buildings that occupy this 2-acre space. They are often interrupted with rockeries so that you can never see all of these buildings at once. As you progress through their series of 4 courtyards, you are led through this labyrinthine, like a maze of pathways and halls, each one beautifully decorated with the most sumptuous and ornate materials imaginable. Now, it is through art that the emperor, I think, reveals himself or his ambitions most directly. And that's one of the fascinating features of the Qianlong emperor. The garden was one place where he could imagine himself in a more relaxed mode. And here we see a portrait of the youthful emperor pretending to be a Chinese dilettante, a Chinese scholar. He's holding a brush, about to write a poem on a banana leaf. All of this, of course, has literary precedence. He's wearing a style of hat that recalls Ming Dynasty hats. His robe with long sleeves is not the close-fitting Manchu-style dress at all. It's a Ming style of robe with beautiful, ornate decor. So we see here whether the emperor actually dressed like that or whether he simply wanted to have himself portrayed in this manner is really the question that I want to pose today. The title of my talk, Art, Artifice, and Identity, really goes to the point that the Qianlong emperor was very much someone who wanted to manipulate art to create different personas. And one of the most important influences on the emperor was none other than Giuseppe Castiglione, or Lang Shening in Chinese. Castiglione had come to China around 1715. He remained there the remainder of his life, some 40 years, almost 50 years. 1765 he died. During that period, he had an opportunity to influence Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong, and he was Qianlong's favorite artist. And I think you can see in the realistic portraiture that Castiglione brought to the court that there was an almost photorealistic treatment of individuals that Qianlong immediately recognized had a tremendous power to influence how we read these pictures. It was not simply a fantasy. it looked like reality. So here he is as a gentleman scholar strumming on a zither, something that a Han Chinese scholar or literatus would have indulged in. So we see the emperor presenting himself in the guise of a Chinese scholar. And it was through Castiglione that these kinds of imaginary portraits were perpetuated. Perhaps the most important and famous, it's not in the exhibition unfortunately, it's an immense painting, it's some 10 feet tall, is showing the emperor on horseback. And this is something that no emperor had ever been portrayed in a formal way in this manner before. But it's very clear that Castiglione must have been aware of Verrocchio's sculpture in Venice. Castiglione himself was Italian. And so whether it was Verrocchio or whether it was Velázquez, the tradition in the West of showing rulers, monarchs, generals mounted on horseback, preparing for battle in full regalia, is something that clearly caught the emperor's imagination. This is pure propaganda. I don't think Qianlong ever entered into a battle, although he waged many campaigns in Western China, subduing a number of tribesmen in that area. But what is notable is that he is presented as if he were about to enter battle. So this use of art to create the image, the persona of emperor as ruler on horseback, as someone who could command a military operation, was clearly an inspiration from the West. This is a long tradition, of course, and everyone may remember that when we were initiating our move into Iran, that President Bush particularly liked to talk from that part of the White House where Teddy Roosevelt was galloping into action. So I believe that political use of art has a long tradition. It certainly goes back to Roman times and earlier, and it continues to this day, although I suspect that President Obama wouldn't be caught dead in this room. Now, here's another amazing image that's in the catalog that is of Qianlong with his children celebrating New Year's. They're setting off firecrackers here, and there's many recensions of this same image. Sometimes we see them making a snow lion, and some of the younger children are one dandling on his father's knee, servants looking on. And notice the rootwood furniture. You'll see examples of that in the exhibition upstairs. So this is clearly part of the informal gardens of the emperor, probably the Yuanmingyuan or the Summer Palace, not the halls that we're dealing with. But nonetheless, there's been no precedent for this kind of image before in Chinese history. And I think it was clear that Castiglione had a major role in influencing the emperor to have this kind of image made, and no doubt it was directly influenced by the kinds of genre paintings that Dutch artists like Pieter de Hoek were doing in the mid-17th century. So there's been already a 100-year tradition of these kind of pictures being made in the West prior to their introduction into China. And notice the extraordinary parallels here. The elder couple with their children arrayed around them are in a garden. There's a rose bush growing in the background, symbol of the continuity of their line. Roses also symbolic of the family crest. There's fruit here on the table, more vines growing up here. And as you look out the vista of this open doorway, you see the spire of the church pointing to infinity. So it has both religious and secular symbolism. The same can be done if you parse this painting. We have all the emblems of power here. Plum, pine, and bamboo are the three auspicious friends of wintry weather that symbolize longevity, continuity, and renewal. And you even have this vista out through the moon gate and a little pavilion spire echoing the same kind of function in the church spire. So clearly, the Jesuits were bringing imagery and ideas to the emperor about how to utilize art to construct different personas. These things were not hung in galleries for the public to see. I think clearly the only audience that Qianlong had in mind, besides indulging his own eccentricity and ego, was perhaps for history. Now, in the exhibition, we have a remarkable example of what is commonly called trompe-l'oeil painting, fools the eye. So this is an example of how the Qianlong emperor recognized that art was an illusion and that he wanted to play with those illusory characteristics of art by having panels, full-size panels that covered entire walls of his studios covered with these kinds of paintings. There are only 8 surviving trompe-l'oeil images like this. 5 of them are in this garden. So clearly this was a conceit that the emperor indulged in over and over again. And you can see in our installation that there is an actual structure here. It looks a little bit trimmed, but you can see this is the woodwork, and the woodwork reflects the painted decor. So the woodwork was in the same studio, juxtaposed with the painting, and the artist simply mimicked the actual architecture to create the illusion that the room was twice as big as you might think it is. And when you enter the illusory space, you also get a wonderful idea of the kind of spaces that the emperor enjoyed. All of them intimate in scale, low ceilings, and very confined. So you have little doorways on the left and right that are covered. This would have been in a part of the palace that he would have used presumably in the wintertime when he was most in residence in the Forbidden City. You can see that on the table at the back there are bronze antiquities, contemporary ceramics, lots of books for him to read, and this marvelous hanging scroll, which they mount in a certain way that it doesn't even fit in the room. So it's actually bent up onto the ceiling here. I would be ostracized from the community of museum curators if I tried to do that. But there it is. So that's how the Qianlong Emperor solved that problem. He got the painting at the right height. Oh, he bent it a little bit. You can always have it remounted. But even more interesting is in these particular spaces, on top of this ornately patterned wallpaper, he also had paintings pasted right on the wall. And you'll see in the exhibition there are a number of inscriptions composed by the emperor himself, by his son, others, that were actually pasted on the wall. So part of the decoration scheme in these rooms was not to hang scrolls, but to actually adhere things right to the wallpaper. So you have this tradition as well, that this mural helps us to understand. The exciting thing about the exhibition is it tells us that the emperor he delighted in using one material to imitate other materials. So this is a depiction of one of the courtyards that is in the larger Tranquil Longevity Palace. It is actually a 3-story theater where we have young children performing here, presumably for the emperor's mother, who would have been hidden behind this screen, and there are tables set with dishes for a banquet afterwards. This was to celebrate her 85th birthday in 1776. So when she died the following year, the emperor commissioned this piece as a lasting memorial, and if you look carefully, you'll see that the entire surface is made up of cloisonné enamels. It's not a painting at all. It is the laborious process of creating these cloisons, or little borders or dams of copper, and then filling it with paste, which then, when fired, becomes hardened into different enamels. So it is an exhibition over in the Bard Study Center now on the west side that celebrates this art technique, which goes back at least to the Mongol period. But in the hands of the Qianlong Emperor, he could order anything he wanted, so he created a memorial to his mother and had one of his high court officials add an inscription also done as cloisonné. Another trompe-l'oeil, if you will, transference or transformation of media is this marvelous panel of a plum blossom, a blossoming plum tree. This is actually in the Zhuanqianzhai, the studio of exhaustion from exhaustion from labors, extended labors. That is the one building in the complex that has now been restored. This is the only piece from that restoration that was allowed to travel again. And you can see it's a marvelous 5-foot wide, 3.5-foot tall piece, immensely heavy. Why? Because it is not painted. It is inlaid with lapis lazuli, malachite, sandalwood, and jade for all the components. So this is, again, a suggestion of how the emperor could have pictorial arts transferred into yet another medium of precious materials. And the entire every surface in this garden is treated with exactly that kind of luxury. Here is a remarkable example. This is a detail of a screen that shows the 16 lohans, or arhats, the disciples of the Buddha, the historical Buddha. It's actually mythology that grew up later in Central Asia and in China, where the subject became very popular. And this is an echo of a 10th century set of portrayals of these craggy men, often portrayed as foreigners, or certainly as wizened and sort of eccentric looking, almost grotesque individuals, to convey the notion that spirituality cannot be judged by outer appearances. So those 10th century paintings were later copied, carved into stone, and rubbings were made. So if you know, in China, rubbings would be a white image against a black ground, black ink ground. If you look at an actual rubbing, you can see that the illusion of making a rubbing out of these screens is quite complete. This is a set of rubbings that was made to incorporate all of the great calligraphy in the emperor's collection, the Shichu Baoji library of 32 volumes of calligraphy that Emperor Qianlong had carved into stone and in this way perpetuated as a lasting monument to his collecting and his ability to control Han Chinese culture. But in fact, these 16 panels are not rubbings at all. They are black lacquer inlaid with white jade. So they're extraordinarily precious, and of course then the jade has been etched and drawn upon in black ink. So you have the illusion of something relatively inexpensive made with the most precious substances imaginable. What is even more indicative of the emperor's ability to use these resources extravagantly is these screens were set into the wall of one of his rooms. They actually cover 3 sides of a room so that in there, when they go back on display, you'll only be able to see this side. But when they were removed for restoration, turns out that the other side was also covered with paintings. Gold and silver pigments were used to create images of flowers, landscapes, garden scenery, which had been invisible for over 200 years. So this is the kind of extravagance the emperor could indulge in. He wanted them set into the wall. Didn't worry about the fact that you couldn't see the beautiful ornate drawings on the other side. Buddhism is also featured in maybe 5 or 6 of the 27 halls in the garden. There are small shrines, there are effigies, there are Buddhist decorations that are clearly an important part of the cosmos that the garden represents. So, in particular, we see some of these esoteric Buddhist deities, wrathful manifestations that are typical of Tibetan Buddhism. And the emperor was particularly fond of Tibetan Buddhism because the lamas had persuaded him that he was actually a manifestation of Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom. So the ability to be both a secular ruler and at the same time one of the embodiments of wisdom for all ages was enormously appealing to Qianlong. He considered himself a Chakravartin ruler. This is the term used first in India for the universal king who would rule over all of the empire, but all of the world, in fact. So this imagery was enormously appealing. So here you are, you could worship yourself in your own garden. And how did he demonstrate to himself that he was this universal ruler? Qianlong indulged in collecting objects that came from every area in the globe with whom China had relationships. There's a pair of these cupboards in the exhibition. The workmanship is clearly Japanese. The imagery, the landscape, the figures are all something that I don't think the Chinese would have imitated. They certainly were capable of fine lacquer work, but this entire cabinetry, including the foot, is of an integral construction, so it now appears that these were made explicitly as presentation pieces for the emperor, because this is not a style. The Japanese would never use this kind of footed cabinet. They would have had the cabinet right at the level of the tatami. Also, the symmetrical arrangement of the drawers is atypical for Japan. So here is an example of Chinese taste being reinterpreted and taken back to China. European potentates competed to give the emperor particularly clocks. He was enamored of these mechanical clocks. This one has somebody ringing the bell here. It looks like it's snowing in this area when the clock is moving. It's got English written down here, so it may be from England or France. We're not sure. But China today has the largest collection of antique European clocks in the world. It's because there's a whole palace filled with these things. And then, of course, starting with Kangxi, the Chinese began to imitate the European clocks. And this has a plate right here that says Qianlong Nianzhi, so it was made during the Qianlong reign. You have wonderful lotus blossom patterning on the background, but you notice the Roman numerals and the Arabic numerals have been retained. So it is another example of this hybridization of art that took place under the Qianlong ruler. Just as chinoiserie was inspiring Europeans with pictures of mandarins cavorting in pavilions in the landscape, Qianlong had his version of Europeanisme with this pair of lovers in a bucolic setting on a mirrored surface screen, the kind of thing that was made first in Europe but was introduced into China, and probably a lot of this kind of material was made for export back to Europe, just with the Chinese labor added, and of course the beautiful Chinese frame as well. But this one ended up in the palace, probably as a presentation piece to the emperor, who had many of these kinds of things. There are a pair of screens that have this European-style landscape and architecture, and particularly note that the rowboat here has a British naval ensign on it. No wonder the emperor was not intimidated by the British Navy. He said, oh, they have just rowboats, so we can do better than that. So unfortunately, he didn't know about the man-of-wars that were also sailing the seas. One of the most extraordinary commissions that is retained in the palace, and which is now in the Met's collection, in addition to the things from the Forbidden City, there is one gallery, the Francis Young Tang Gallery, that is kind of interposed between the two arms of the galleries around the garden that hold the Forbidden Cities exhibit. We have an exhibit of paintings of the court from the Qianlong era in the Met's own collection. And one of our resources is a set of 16 copper plate engravings. The designs were made by Castiglione, Attiret, and other Jesuits attached to the Qianlong court. They took these designs to celebrate the emperor's conquest of the western tribal regions in what is now Xinjiang province. And those conquests took place from around 1755 to 1759, but by 1765 you have Castiglione making a design. So it's all apocryphal, it's all rather imaginary, but it is vivid nonetheless, as you can see from these details that show warriors combating the Qing armies, fighting off some of these nomadic tribesmen. But those designs were sent to Paris, and Louis XV had his finest engravers create a set of 16 plates and a set of 200 sets of prints from those plates were sent back to China along with the copper plates themselves as a purchase from the Cantonese merchants who had commissioned these things. So we have a clear example of Western art being introduced back into China as a commission created first in China, sent to Europe to be executed, and then brought back. So these etchings include an image of the emperor himself. This is the Great Meridian Gate, the entrance to the Forbidden City, where he's being presented with a head wrapped in silk of one of the rebels, as they were called, and some of the prisoners here. This was a typical ritual that took place at the Meridian Gate. There was also a celebratory banquet that was held. Here's the Beihai in the background, and you can see this use of Western-style perspective with the diminishing scale of these figures. The emperor coming in on the right, and on the left you have all of the subdued tribesmen who are paying homage to the emperor. So this is the kind of propaganda that Qianlong commissioned for himself through his Western Jesuit artists. And we have a striking example of that collaboration in the collection. This is a portrait of one of the imperial bodyguards who was a hero at one of the battles in Central Asia, and it's very clear that the Western-style use of portraiture with modeling in shade and light was used to depict the face, whereas the rest of the body was portrayed in a more traditional manner, which suggests there were 100 of these portraits made in 1760 to commemorate the triumphant end of all these campaigns. And I want you to notice right here, there is a little unpainted spot below the neckline. So clearly, the face was painted first. The man who did the robes came along, but he wasn't allowed to use flesh color. So there was a little disconnect there. So we have a sense that this was a collaborative effort, just as those engravings were collaborative. So we sense that there was a workshop-style tradition to crank out these kind of portraits with the expert artist doing the face. The rest of the costume was done by a lesser hand. I'm sure that happens in Rubens' studio as well. So among the Met's treasures are a pair of paintings that celebrate the emperor's Southern Inspection Tour of 1751. They were actually completed in 1770 in time for his 60th birthday. And it shows the emperor touring various important cultural sites and strategic points in the empire. Here he is on his white charger entering the Shumen of Suzhou. And you'll notice that the long vistas that are used strategically to draw the eye from the distance right down to the emperor, converging pretty much at his feet, was a European technique. You see the same kind of perspective being used in Western images commissioned by the emperor himself. But these scrolls were all done by Chinese artists. There were no European participants. So it shows that out of this collaboration between East and West, then a new hybrid style of art arose at the court with this kind of photorealism at its core. So you have this wonderful sense of diminishing scale, giving you a sense of perspective. And it is that sense of realism, beginning with the anatomically correct use of renderings of the body. You had to create a physical-looking space that could support those bodies, that this kind of propaganda art gained its sense of credence, it gained a sense of authenticity and reliability that the emperor really used to affect a sense of his grandiosity. It was a way of celebrating and commemorating him, but ultimately it was a way of painting for history, to give him a sense of his enormous success as a ruler, to document his effectiveness. And even this has echoes of the sense of the emperor as almost a semi-divine person. This is St. Ignatius Loyola being greeted by Christ as he's beatified, as he comes into heaven. So one has a sense that the use of dramatic poses, almost a tableau vivant, that were part of the court repertoire of art, was very much influenced and shaped by this European collaboration. So as we walk through the exhibition today, we're given a chance to see the inside of this remarkable garden. But it is also a sobering opportunity as well, because when we imagine ourselves standing on the balcony of the Fuwangge, it is the pavilion for reviewing one's accomplishments. Clearly, all the emperor could see was box after box, walled compound after compound, a sense of the grandeur of his world, but also he was looking at an illusion. He was so taken in by the artifice of his own art that he probably couldn't imagine that when Lord Macartney came in 1794 to plead for the opening of economic relations with George III, that there was any point to engaging in a serious diplomatic relationship with the British monarch. He dismissed Lord Macartney out of hand by saying, "Our celestial empire has everything in such abundance. We have no need for your king." So that telling myopia, I think, is also makes us recognize that even from the perspective of the most powerful country on earth, that there's always a limit to one's prosperity, there's always a limit to one's power. And I think if one were to paraphrase the immortal words of John Donne, no nation is entire of itself. Every country is part of the main. Every country is a part of the globe entire. And that, I think, is the ultimate moral about this story, that when we see the glory of China's past, we have to remember that that glory also obfuscated a reality that inhibited the emperor from recognizing that it was time to adapt to new ways of governance and new ways of relating to the rest of the world. It is an extraordinary world that he's built for himself, but it is not a world that allowed him to see beyond its walls. Thank you.